quote of his on Facebook, and people were still so positive. Like it was basically saying, look, Paul's saying things are going to get worse because the enemy knows that his time is cut short, and as he sees the time approaching, he's going to get worse and worse and worse, which is what we see ultimately in the book of Revelation, where you see that that final period of time where things go chaotically bad. But yeah, this is going to happen. But yeah, there's always been evil. But I found it funny that when I posted it, people were always trying to bring up the positive of how we have progressed and we made. But it was funny when people talk about progress that we made. I was amazed how many times they brought up technology.
But that's the only progress we made.
Exactly, and I thought that's just technology. That's not morality.
That's it.
You know,
no, morality is the same.
Morality is the same. On the contrary, we this is like like right now what's happening with Russia to me is, I mean, as somebody who studies history and been studying this stuff, this is very much what happened right before World War One. Society was progressing. People were so optimistic. They thought they had made it, that everything was fine, that we had really become so advanced, and then the war broke out, and the world was set into chaos. And just as they're recovering, World War II breaks out.
Well, I have my opinion about these things, and I spoke to Nico a couple of weeks ago about what's happening in Russia, and it all goes back to World War One. When the war ended, 1918, there was a civil war in Russia between the Bolsheviks and the White Army that wanted to put the Tsar back in power, and they were killing each other. But the West gave help to the White Army, okay? Meaning that they gave arms, weapons, money, and men.
Wow.
And the Bolsheviks, the communists, eventually they won, but they never forgot that the West helped the enemy. So when World War II ended, Stalin, with all the wave of Russian offensive, took over all those countries in the periphery of the Soviet Union, which was Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Romania, Hungary. They put communist governments and all that. That was like a buffer, okay? Because they thought the West was going to take over Russia. So they had a buffer there on those communist countries. So when the communist power of the Soviet Union collapsed and all those countries became independent, a lot of generals didn't like that, okay? Because Stalin didn't like that. And Putin was one of those that never liked that, okay? That's why he annexed Crimea a couple of years ago, and nobody said anything. He's threatening Finland.
Yeah.
Now he's taking Belarus is ally of Russia, and now he's taking Ukraine because he's got this mentality to have this buffer zone in there. And then when they found out that Ukraine wanted to belong to NATO, that flipped his thing, And then he really said, so his mentality is this having a buffer because he has this idea that the West is going to take over Russia sometime in the future.
Well, I don't know why he would think that, considering that, right across the other side on the other side is Alaska. So I don't know. I mean, we're right there. We're not. It's not like we're so far away.
Yeah, but Alaska is close to Siberia. It's nothing Siberia.
I mean, if the Earth was flat, we would have. I would see why he's concerned. Maybe he thinks the Earth is flat.
That's his mentality. I mean, Stalin had this paranoia, this compulsion, and when he was told by Churchill that Germany was going to invade Russia in 1941, he did not believe it.
Yeah.
Because he never trusted the West.
Well, but my point is different. My point is that we have the human illusion that somehow we can make progress, that we can become a civilized world, that things can be peaceful. And so when something like this happens, it kind of throws all that into chaos. And we're back to square one. And now, not only back to square one, but again with the greater threat of nuclear war. So showing that, we have this image of humanity advancing and progressing and becoming better. And it's like, no, humans are humans. And you're always going to find people that are evil and people that have their own agenda and people that want to oppress others and want to conquer. And whatever their agenda is, whatever Putin's agenda is, what he's doing is just horrendously evil, and
Sure.
he has no conscience about it. He's just doing it. And I just found it amazing that the world is so weak, because I mean, when a powerful nation threatens you with nuclear power, I'm like, dude, like the president of France told Putin, we all have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Yeah, a reminder that what are you threatening with?
I know.
We can make,
no position to threaten anybody.
before you shoot before you do shoot yours, we can just make the whole Russia into a parking lot.
Exactly.
I mean, so
Exactly.
what's the but the fact that the other nations would even permit that kind of talk, I was like, that's like we always tell children, oh, don't let people bully you, and bullies are wrong. And this guy is becoming like the massive bully, thinking that he can just push through and do whatever. But yeah, that's the illusion that we always think that things, but
No, of course not. No.
but as the time draws near to the end, things are going to go from bad to worse to worse to worse. I mean, sometimes you imagine it can't get worse, but it can. Like even in the book of Revelation, when you see the devastation upon the earth, I'm trying to remember how much it was. It was like 1/3, then 1/2, then like 3/4. Like slowly but surely, the earth is being devastated slowly but surely. Like it's almost like waves of tsunami, just hitting upon the earth with all the disasters. And now that we are in the nuclear age, it doesn't seem far-fetched when you think about it, because you think, how can you devastate 1/3 of the earth, destroy the plant life, destroy everything? Yes, you can. Today we can do it, of course.
On the other hand, the book of Revelation talks about horses and people on horses, and you will think, with nuclear weapons, why are they using horses? Maybe the reason is because if you drop a nuclear weapon in any city, it's going to be collateral damage all over it. So you cannot use nuclear weapons any place. It's just a matter of talking.
Yeah, well,
so maybe they will use horses and horsemen.
Yeah, I think the horses, because it's John writing it, and there was no such thing as cars or tanks or things of that nature yet. So it's.
But as we talk about, so many things technology has become so sophisticated, like drones. You don't use, now they have drones in ships and tanks and all that.
Yeah.
So you don't use people anymore.
Yeah.
More and more, it's going to be more sophisticated, that nobody's going to be able to use any nuclear weapons, because it's going to destroy themselves.
Yeah. Well, and like we know, we nuclear weapons not something that we even have like here. We know that there are submarines that carry nuclear. So again, we could have a sub near Russia with a nuclear arsenal ready to destroy them. So
it doesn't have to be near Russia. It could be the other side of the world.
That's true. That's true.
And the rocket will go all the way to the circumference.
And Russia really doesn't have the technology. I don't think they have the technology to be as protective as let's say America or China.
No, it does not.
Things are going to get bad, and so this passage certainly carries that idea as well. But it actually doesn't talk about the end times in the sense of the cataclysmic damage that will come to the earth. It's really about the immorality that will be demonstrated by humanity, and that's what Paul deals with. Paul places the problem of heresy into a prophetic framework. The main difference to be seen here is the focus on the lifestyle of false belief. They have a form of godliness rather than the fact of falling away or demonic influence. We have to remember when we're reading this passage, that we do forget that the Bible didn't have chapters and verses. Sometimes people treat chapters and verses like that's they were always there, but no, they were added on centuries later. And thank God they were. I think it was a great idea. Whoever came up with it was very smart, because it makes it much easier to find things in the Bible when you have chapter and verse. But I remember at the end of chapter 2, we read, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. And so Paul was just talking about the enemy captivating individuals to do his will. And so when he continues to describe what he's describing here, he's describing demonic behavior, things that are inspired by evil. These are all the characteristics of the enemy, not of God. This is the characteristics of those who oppose God. And so definitely a demonic influence, demonic, diabolical behavior. So that's important to keep that in mind. You know, again, we're shifting from chapter 2 to 3, but technically there is no real divisions. It's good to read the Bible and just, you know, sometimes don't pay attention to too much to divisions, because then you might stop thinking, well, that segment finished, and no, that segment didn't finish. You know, it's like I've been going through the Beatitudes, and so I've been reading that whole section from Matthew 5 to Matthew 7, which is part of a whole sermon. And then you see you see how it's weaved together and connected, and so all of a sudden those things make more sense when you see them in light of each other instead of isolating them. And then it doesn't make sense. Why are you saying this here, and what does he mean? Well, when you see it together, you realize, oh, okay, that makes better sense. Any questions? Anything else before we jump in?
Well, I want to jump in a little bit. Just a question.
Sure.
Verse 8.
8.
8.
Okay, why 8? Okay. Yes.
Because this is a question I wanted to ask for a long time. So just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses,
yes,
also this teacher opposed the truth. Where did he get those names?
That's apocryphal. It came down in Jewish tradition. I wrote down where they came from, but yes, it was apocryphal. It's not from the Bible. Let me see.
So maybe he had access to certain books that we do not have.
Of course, he has Jewish tradition. This is from Jewish tradition. Let me see if I find the section where it says where it comes from.
Oral tradition or written tradition?
As far as I know, oral, not written.
Okay.
Let me see, where is it? You jumped ahead, okay. I gotta find it. Now I won't be content if I don't find it. I'm sure I had it. I remember reading it.
All right, maybe when we get to that bridge, we cross over.
No, I just wrote it down that according to tradition. So it's oral tradition. Those are the two sorcerers. Yeah, so he gets that, you know, sometimes things will come up in the Bible where you're like, hey, where did they get that from? And it's oral tradition. You know, again, Paul is steeped in the Pharisaical tradition. And so he not only has scripture, he also has the teachings of the rabbis and things like that. So what eventually became the Mishnah. But so yeah, this was an oral tradition, not from written.
The Bible.
Yeah.
Not from the Old Testament.
No, the Old Testament doesn't mention that. It mentions the sorcerers, but doesn't name them.
Right.
So the names came in later. I don't know who ultimately gave them those names, but any other question? Okay, let's verse 1. But mark this, there'll be terrible times in the last days. The world, as an opposing force led by Satan, is waging a war against God and his people. Jesus spoke of this war plainly in the scriptures, and so did Paul. The war would take many shapes, and God's people were to be ready for the attack of a hostile, persecuting enemy. But surely one of the cruelest aspects was to be Satan's penetration into the church in the form of false teachers who would oppose the gospel with one of their own making and then draw away the unsuspecting and unprepared people. The term terrible characterized the events of the last days as dangerously wild and out of control. We know that we have an enemy who's been defeated at the cross. His days are numbered, and as it moves on, it gets worse and worse. But one of the tactics of the enemy is to infiltrate the church. And one of the best ways to do it is by having false teachers, false teachings. And once you're able to plant seeds of disruption like that in a church, if you really are not capable of answering it and dealing with it, then it will take root. And people begin to believe this stuff. And again, it's much easier to plant these heresies. People get fascinated by heresies. It's funny if you want to give people like the truth, they're not as interested in the truth. But if you give them falsehoods, if you give them fairy tales, if you give them fantastical things, oh my goodness, then they'll run after those things. And so the people of God have to be so careful that when we hear things that sound very fanciful, is it biblical? Is it true? And if you're not rooted in the Word of God, yes, it's very easy to be led astray. And of course, this is where the enemy works. He works to lead people astray from the gospel. And of course, making his own gospel. And this is not a new thing. This is something that began right at the beginning of the church. Jesus warned us about the false teachers, false messiahs coming in. Paul made it very clear it's going to happen, and it just continues to happen. So we have to be alert to that. The surprising thing is that this is not a prediction of the very end, but the whole age begun by Christ, which will conclude with his return. From the moment that Christ ascended until Christ returns, that is the last days. That's when people say, oh, we're living the last days. We have been living in the last days for 2,000 years.
Exactly.
The last days are between the ascension and the second coming. Now, there is a period of time called the last days, which is a 7-year period spoken about in the book of Revelation. That's like the climax. But all of it is the end times. That's why Paul's talking about things that are relevant to his time as well as our time. These false teachers, these false people who have come in and teaching things that are different, these characteristics are characteristics that they have already. These are not new characteristics. They false teachers have been like this since the beginning and will continue until Christ returns. Of course, again, as we draw near to the end, it will get worse. That's why when people again think that the end is here already. No, I don't see it. I mean, and I've been around for a while now. It's like no longer, I remember when I became a Christian, I was 15 years old, and one of the first things that I became aware of was Hal Lindsey of the late great Planet Earth. And I felt horrible because I thought the end was coming. The world was going to end. And I thought, my goodness, I'm 15 years old. I just became a Christian. It's almost like I felt like it was like walking into a party and then they tell you, hey, we're going to close up in 5 minutes. What? I just got here. How can this happen, And of course, all these preachers on the radio, I mean, I don't know if they still do it, but Raul Reese, Greg Laurie, all these individuals, end time.
Occasionally they do it. Occasionally.
Oh man, I was just bombarded with the end times. I mean, I recently listened to a whole thing by Greg Laurie about the end times. He's had to shift. Because he was so focused on the end times, but he's still preaching it. And I found it funny because he was saying, oh, why didn't the end come yet? And he looked at the young people, because he's always been with young people in his congregation. And he said, because of you guys, because, God wanted you to be saved. And I was thinking, come on, man. In 40 years, you can say the same thing. Yeah. There'll be another generation. 20 years from now, there will be people in their 20s. What are you going to say? Oh, that the end hasn't come because of them? I mean, he had to say something because he was so fixated on the end times. But I walked into the church as a 15-year-old thinking, oh, it's over. It's going to end any day now. And I just got here. Well, what is it, 40-something years later? We're still here, people.
That book that you mentioned, that the last great planet Earth, that's a book that revolutionized the mind of Jonathan Cahn of Beth Israel. He mentioned that several times. Mm-hmm. That he was an unbeliever, and by reading that book, he really turned his way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, hey, if something like that leads people to Christ, amen. Praise God. That's a good thing. But the bad thing, but the bad thing is you've had a whole series of people crying wolf for so long that I think there's going to be greater apathy as we draw near to the end, because people are going to say, yeah, right, the end, sure.
Exactly, like
Harold Camping, and not only, and of course there is a secular version of it too, because I saw when they did that movie 2012, which was again devastation coming upon the earth. So there is a secular idea of the end of time also, where I've seen a number of movies that come out where it's almost like apocalyptic. Some of them, some of them are like the end of the world type. Some are like, zombie type. And it's almost like, something's going to happen, They all have this idea that some sort of chemical warfare or some sort of virus or something. I was watching a series. I was rewatching it called 12 Monkeys based upon the movie. And I found it funny because I was rewatching it, and this was like, came out in 2016, 2015. And it's about a virus that kills most of the population. And as they're trying to fix the virus, it continues to mutate and kill more people. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. That was back in 2015, 2016. And I said, you see, one day the science fiction will be real life. But there is that sense of people having the end time. But for Christian, I think we have to be careful, because when we start saying the end, and people really start believing that we are at the end and it doesn't come, then people are going to get disheartened. Oh, come on, just like it says in Peter. Oh, come on, the prophecies are not going to come true. This is not going to happen. Things are going to go on just like they've gone on before, like they happened during our father's time. They're going to happen again. And people will become disheartened. So I think as Christians, we have to be very careful not to be trying to use this tactic to like scare people into heaven, scare people to accept Christ by telling them about, the end times. But yeah, some preachers haven't stopped doing it. Maybe they have nothing, I don't know. I think that I know as a pastor, as a preacher, as a teacher, I'm always looking to grow. I think we need to grow. I think that if we come back, if I live long enough and we have another Bible study that eventually comes back to Timothy, my next study in Timothy should be more profound and better and more insightful than the same old notes being repeated over and over again.
I think the same way too, because the studies that I did, let's say 9 years ago, like the book of John, that's the book I started 10 years ago, if I had to do it again, it would not be the same. Those notes would not be useful.
Yeah.
Because I have access to more things right now and my own, progression.
Exactly. And that's the way I would expect preachers and teachers to be. So when you hear a preacher, preaching the same material, preaching the same lessons again about the end times over and over again, it becomes like, I remember I took a class once. It was on 19th century theology, and I was looking forward to it. One of the most discouraging things about the class, the content was good because obviously it was new to me. I didn't know about 19th century theology, and I enjoyed learning about it. But when the professor came in, his notes were on paper, right? And the paper was like super yellow and super old. And the first thought I had when I saw his notes were, when was the last time you revised those notes? Because every study, whether it's 19th century theology or whatever, there's always constant growth, constant renewal. New studies came out, new books, new ideas. So when you see somebody come into it like, wrinkly yellow notes, you're like, oh, I thought that was very discouraging for me. And of course I didn't want to speak my mind, but I thought, wow, at least photocopy the notes and make it look like it's new. But don't come in. So how difficult could it be to like print up new ones or something, But yeah, it was very, very sad. And some preachers are like that. They're dealing with notes that they had when they came out of seminary, I've heard pastors that have been teaching things or preaching things that they learned in seminary, which is like, for some it's 10, 20, 30 years, and they really have not advanced. And that, again, that's shameful. I think all preachers and teachers should be constantly learning, constantly going back into the Word, And when we discover something that we don't know, like for me, when I find something that this is insightful, I'll put it into my computer. I put it into my notes, so that when I get back to that text again, I can share more insights, or in preaching I can share those insights. But now I'm preaching also. So, any questions? Any comments? Okay, verses 2-5. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people. The ungodly are those who oppose God. Verses 2 to 5 comprise a list of 18 traits that present a caricature of people totally concentrated on themselves and in opposition to God. Paul's tool here is what's called the vice catalog. They used to be in the ancient world, there would be like virtue catalogs and vice catalogs that people would rattle off things that were good as things that were bad. And here he talks about identification, who they are, who these people are, and also denunciation, denouncing them, saying, yes, this is what we should not be. We should not have any part to do with people like this. Anyone's life whose life conforms to this list in any part bears marks of unbelief, whatever claims to faith might be made. The theme of the first 4 items is selfishness. Lovers of themselves are those who place themselves in first place in all things. That is all they're concerned about, unless, of course, they put money there first. They might be lovers of money, but it's all about them. They are the ones who are number one. They look at other people as objects, as things, to be used as pawns for their own desires, for their own needs. And there are, unfortunately, so many human beings like that, who, on the exterior, they may have a form of even humanity, that they're nice people. But inside, their main thing is how can I manipulate others? How can I control others to do what I want them to do, so I can advance in the way that I want to advance? And every now and then we catch a glimpse of someone like that. But there are people that are so good at it that they play it off like something else, like they're being benevolent or they're being wonderful people. But all the while, their own concern is them. They love themselves. This love is a source of evil because it separates one from God. Selfish people are naturally boastful and proud. One thing you see about selfish people, they always talk about how great they are, all the wonderful achievements, all the great things they've done, and they can't stop rattling off all the wondrous things that they are accomplishing. Completely lacking in humility, they speak to draw attention to themselves, and in their thoughts see themselves as the center of the universe. The fallen world is a source of this boastful pride, and God, of course, stands in opposition to such mentality. Next come 2 terms that describe destructive behavior. Abusive talk tears down other people, usually to build oneself up. So, it's like, there are people that purposely put others down so that they can feel exalted. They cannot be happy for other people. They cannot raise up other people. They don't even want to focus on the positive of people. On the contrary, they always focus on the negative. They always see the blemish. They always see the dirt, and that's what they focus on. But again, is to embellish themselves, is to bring themselves up. Equally dangerous for the family relationship is these people's flagrant disobedience of parents. In Paul's and Timothy's day, this sin set one off as fundamentally rebellious at heart. For the attitude towards parents was understood as a reflection as a deeper attitude towards God. How you were in the household was a picture of how you would be in society and how you would be in your relationship to God. So Paul is working off that idea. Today, maybe we're not that focused on that idea, at least not in our culture. But in the ancient world, if you were a rebellious individual against your parents, it was viewed that you would not be a good citizen. And you certainly would not be a good believer in your God and follow, you would not be a good community person. If you can't get along with your own parents and you're insulting them and being argumentative towards them, it only goes to show that you would do the same thing with other people in other communities. These individuals set themselves above the feelings of others and the authority of their parents. Not only this is extremely selfish, but it's also extremely destructive behavior. Any questions? Okay. 4 negative unwords follow: ungrateful, unholy, unloving, which the NIV renders without love, and unforgiving, each depict the opposite of a characteristic of true faith. Attitudes generated by a deep-seated selfishness that threatens relationships seem to be in mind. Holiness is a matter of inner purity, so unholy is probably a broad description of vile thoughts and motives. The next two terms focus on speech and behavior. Slanderous, again, refers to destructive use of the tongue to spread rumors and lies about other people. And this, of course, is humans are so contagious. This is so contagious. People have a tendency to slander others. You know, it's funny how we permit ourselves to pass on things that we've heard about people, even though we don't even verify whether it's true or not. We just, we hear something and that's destructive towards someone, and we pass on that information. And that's the slander. Actually, the Greek word is blasphemia, just like blaspheme for God. Is the same thing. Being slanderous is blaspheming others who are creating the image of God. So we have to be careful not to do that. Other passages imply two things. People prone to slander others destroy the church. And there are people, of course, like that in our churches that they slander. They're looking to divide the church, to bring disunity, this harmony. And, again, just very, very bad characteristic. And, I guess, being a pastor now for 24 years in this church, I'm sure it'd be much harder to see that or have somebody do that. But I remember when I first came to this church, I was not a member. I was just visiting the church, and I was not here, I think, 2-3 weeks when already there was a faction. There were two factions in this church when I got here, and the one faction already confronted me to speak ill about the other faction. And I thought, if I wasn't a solid Christian, I would say, forget this. If I was an atheist, I would say, forget this. These guys are a joke. I just came to visit your church, and within less than 3 weeks, you're telling me the gossip about the other group, and Hatfields and McCoys hanging out here together. And I was like, wow. But what fascinated me was that the other side, the other faction, did not do that. So there's something interesting. There were two factions, two groups, but it was one group that quickly confronted me, trying to draft me onto their side and speaking ill of the other side. And the other side did not do that. And when I chose to be pastor of this church, I had another church that was actually pursuing me as well. But that church was even in worse shape.
Really?
There were two families that were fighting. And I told them, it's funny because one of them, they invited me to lunch. So I had lunch with them. I thought, how cool. And then when the other family invited me to lunch, I realized, oh no, here we go again. Two literal families dividing church. And I thought, this church, but that church, of course, the difference there is that I thought it's not going to survive because it didn't have the income to even be able to have it. They were so poor that they really could not afford a fight. You would think just keep the peace until you're rich and then fight. But no, it's like they were destroying the church, and the church was already so impoverished. But again, imagine, you coming into a church and you hear this kind of stuff. Imagine somebody visiting our church and they hear, oh, there's a number of factions in our church, And it's funny because when I got here, there were two factions, but I found out that before there were four, and then two eventually lost power and left the church. And now there were only two factions fighting each other. I was like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. But you see, this is horrendous, and this is what we find in too many churches. And that's why pastors have to get on top of this stuff. And the leaders have to get on top of this stuff and say, no. We can't have that. So that's why when I hear anything, any kind of rumors like that, I quickly jump on top of it if I know about it. But pastors sometimes are the last people to find out. But this, unfortunately, yeah, it's true, because people will talk to anybody, but they won't talk to the pastor. But unfortunately, these are the things that do go on in churches and bring destruction and disunity to church. Again, the church has to be working towards unity, towards oneness. Doesn't mean we have to agree about everything. No, that's not what it means. But it means that there's harmony, there's love, there's care, there's working together. There's always that openness for reconciliation, for being at peace with each other. Any question? Then Paul goes on to talk about conduct that is without self-control. Again, undisciplined, equally destructive to oneself and to others. Self-control is a qualification that is needed for those who are leaders of the church. You know, if a Christian leader has no self-control over their tongue, over their passions, that's problematic. You know, it's a very important quality to have as Christians. Obviously, I think it's part of the fruit of the Spirit, self-control. But so every Christian should have this, but leaders should especially have this, because if the leader is behaving like the destructive element in the church, then the church loses, because the pastor is part of the problem. You know, you want the pastor and the leadership to be part of the solution to any problem. But when the pastor is himself engaged in that kind of controversy where he is slandering or doing this or that, then of course, you know, then that becomes problematic. Although I did learn early on that if people start gossiping and saying one thing and only one story is out there, you have to let your side of the story be told. Otherwise, people believe that it's true. Because some people will just go out and say, hey, you know, this is about this or that. And then if the other side is never listened to, then you say, oh, of course, it must be true. That's why the pastor is not answering, you know. So sometimes you have to give an answer, you know. But most of the time you try not to do that, because you realize this is only adding fuel to the fire. It's adding destruction to the church. But again, self-control is so important for all believers, but especially for leaders. As the list continues, two more terms identify ungodliness as both ruthless and cold. Brutal, untamed, savage served equally well to describe fierce lions and people who act like them. Again, there are people who are they're brutal. They're brutal in the things they say and the things they do. And, you know, I don't want to discard the possibility that in the early church, just like today, not only is it bad words or slander, there's also physical problems, physical fights. I remember when I first got here, hearing about the fact that in one of the business meetings, were they both trustees, or was one trustee? I think they were both trustees. Two trustees got into a fist fight in a business meeting, and I thought, oh my God. Here in this church, it was not under me. It was not under my leadership. They would be, anybody would be sorry if they did that in my church. I'd be like, no, you'd be under discipline for like a whole year if I had to put you on discipline. You have to sit down and, you know, with each other, facing each other for a whole year if you did that. But they literally got into a fist fight. And it's a shame, because both individuals, I got to know both of them in my time here as pastor. Both of them were wonderful men of God, and both of them had a great love and concern for the church. But they had different visions at times of how things should run. And again, this is like I was talking about factions. One of the gentlemen who actually passed away, and I did his funeral, he was part of an older faction that was here right from the beginning. And but so they had different visions, but they were both godly men. They were men who really loved the Lord. But again, so it's not only that you can have slander, but, you know, things always escalate. And in that case, it did. Thank God it's never happened. I never, in all time I've been a pastor or a member of a church, I've never seen two people going at it physically. So, but unfortunately, it has happened. Not lovers of the good is another opposite of the quality required in church leaders. It suggests a proclivity for evil and a complete lack of moral sensitivity. Verse 4 closes the list with 4 items that help in applying the general list of pagan failings directly to the false teachers troubling the Christian churches. The word treacherous might be better rendered traitors, for it's the treasury of betrayal of the faith and the faithful that is in view. So the idea here, treachery, when it's talking here, is the idea of you're betraying the gospel. You're betraying the teachings of Christ, and you're betraying other believers. Rash or reckless describes these people as those who, out of selfishness, act without thought for others or for possible consequences. And again, we see that when we see people who really don't care, they act rashly. They don't think. They just instead of being slow to speak, they're quick to speak and quick to anger. And we're told to be slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen. And it takes time. Self-control is not something that happens overnight. That quality is not something that happens overnight. And so it's something that we have to really work on to make sure. And if we catch ourselves being the kind of people who just blurt things out, then we need to work on our tongue and our skills of control. That when we hear something, just don't react. Listen. Try to listen. First of all, we're very bad at listening to people. We're always formulating answers when we're talking to people while we're listening. Instead of really just listen to them. Listen to what they have to say. And don't react quickly. Wait. Think about it. Maybe it's something that you need to get away from and pray about before you even come back and give them an answer. So again, we have to be careful of that. A corollary of this thoughtless evil is a badly mistaken view of one's own importance. They are conceited. The self-absorbed, self-gratifying orbit of the ungodly is described well with the phrases lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God. Those who exhibit such qualities listed below belong to the world and not to God. The vice list ends here, but the framing of what Paul is describing of the false teachers does not. The Greek sentence continues in verse 5 to describe one of the most fatal flaws of this heresy. Paul explains that they have a form of godliness, but deny its power. To understand this text, we begin with the word form. The word form is in Greek morphosis, like morphosis, might mean outward appearance, giving the sense of from outer appearances they seem to be godly. When you look at them, they might appear to be very godly people, but it's deceptive, it's superficial. They might appear to be godly because maybe they're denying the flesh, maybe they're being ascetic, people that look very holy. And there are people that, really they're very good at pretending. They come in and they really maybe they have the God language down packed. I've known people that are, oh man, God this and God that and the Lord and this, and they sound great, but again, it's an outward form. I mentioned here before, I was working at church once where a young man came in, and he seemed to be so great. I mean, really on fire for God, really devout, and and the pastor was taken by him, like, oh wow, we can have him working with the youth. And I said, no, we shouldn't get him to work with the youth. We don't know this guy. Take time to test him to make sure. And sure enough, within a short time of being there, we found out he was trying to sleep with the girls in the youth group. Again, it looks good. He looked good. It would look very promising, but it's deceptive. So there are people that, they have a form of godliness, but they really don't have the power of it. It also might be a sense of, today we have a lot of people who claim to be Christians, but they even deny the power of God. They'll say, oh, there's no such thing as miracles, or God really doesn't do those things anymore, or God cannot work powerfully. Yet the Bible is very clear that the power of God is available to us as Christians. One of the most fascinating stories that I read last year, and I can remember, I'm very bad at remembering things. I have to start keeping. See, Julie, memory is not an age thing only. I've always had bad memory. Always. I have to keep the clippings somewhere. There was a pastor that literally, I kid you not, she became an atheist. She stopped believing in God, and yet she continued to be a pastor. And they allowed her to continue to be a pastor. And I was like, what?
Did she change her way of preaching, though, to the people?
Yeah, she became more like, just, be nice, be good, don't hurt others, just moralistic type things, about more humanistic. But she became an atheist. She no longer believed that God existed. Talk about having the form of godliness but denying the power. And yet we see this in many liberal churches are like this today. There are so many churches today that are literally, they're liberal. I mean, aside I can say Baptists, Presbyterians, whatever, but they're liberal. They don't have any sense of the real power of God. They're more like a social club, and they'll do things like that. I remember the Anglican church I was working with. Oh man, there were good Christian people there, but unfortunately Bishop Spong, who was a liberal bishop in the Anglican church, he didn't believe in the virgin birth. He believed that Paul was homosexual. He didn't believe in the resurrection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this guy really was just destroying the Anglican church. And this Anglican church was basically either become a soup kitchen or I close you down. And he did close them down. And it was right a block from where Wycliffe is. And now there's a mosque there. It's a Muslim place. He literally closed that church and sold it to Muslims.
This used to be a Korean church.
Oh, I guess there were Koreans there for a time?
For a time. And after the Koreans became a Muslim.
Well, the building is Anglican. So the Anglican church was being led by Bishop Spong. Because when I went there, I was going there I started visiting and I was going to help them. But when I found that Bishop Spong was the one behind them, I said, sorry, I'm out of here. The devil's in charge here. I can't be here. But now Bishop Spong is dead, so he knows better now. But too late. He's learned how wrong he is, but too late for that. But again, we're dealing with an age where you have people who are ministers, who are bishops, whatever position they have in church, and they're not Christian. They're not Christian. That sounds like Twilight Zone. How can you have ministers who don't believe in God, who don't believe in the actual power of the things of God? And sometimes, unfortunately, this is really what happens. What was that?
I said that's hard to believe.
No.
Be a minister and not believe in God.
Oh yeah, that was a whole.
What do you do when you prepare the sermons? Must be a lot of work trying to preach something that you don't believe in.
Exactly. Which I think what they end up doing is like what is that chicken soup for the soul type thing, where you do you can have you can have like cute platitudes and say, oh, like I said, be nice to each other, help each other. It becomes more like a social movement. You're more like a society to help people out, like feed the poor, a soup kitchen. It becomes more of that. Yeah, you're no longer a church. Yeah, you're no longer proclaiming the gospel. You're no longer talking about the power of God. You talk about, let's help people. So we have more ministries like that, but again, denying the real power of the gospel, because the power of the gospel is the power to transform. Paul makes it very clear, you cannot have doctrine without ethics. To believe in the gospel is to be transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit, to become a new creation. And that involves every aspect of our lives. Our mind, our morality, everything about our whole worldview becomes a Christian worldview, and we behave accordingly. Again, we do the opposite of what these people are doing. We obey our parents. We love God. We're humble. We care about others. It is a moral transformation, not just simply a doctrinal thing. But again, it's happened a lot in our churches, and I saw it more when I was in the Reformed Church, but I've seen it also in the American Baptist. But in the Reformed Church, there were more meetings with other churches. And so I got to see things like homosexual pastors, and I was like, what? What's going on here, people? And then you have other ministers behaving like they don't know what's going on. Come on, guys. Why are we pretending here? You know, we went to visit a pastor, and I was like, I'm serious. The pastor must have been in his 50s. He's not married, right? And he's got 2 young men living with him in his place. And I'm like, seriously, people? Yo, come on! Don't tell me that I'm more worldly than these pastors, and I can tell what's going on here. It was obvious that he was homosexual, and that he had a sexual relationship either with one or both of those young men, and yet he was the pastor of the church, and things went on like nothing. So, any other questions? Any comments? Okay. So Paul, of course, talks about that. He talks about the importance of godliness. And of course, he talks about that this is, of course, is deception. These people who think that they're godly and they're living the way that they're living, they're only deceiving themselves. They deny the power. Denying his power is the second part of this. In Romans 2:20, Paul talked about his opponents who were similar in some respects, and speaking about the spiritual Jews who had the law, they had all these commandments, they had all these things, yet they lived contrary to them. You know, they had like Jesus, when Jesus confronted the Pharisees, they had a very good exterior. They were very good at cleaning the outside of the cup. They were very religious. They appeared very religious. But inwardly, there were maggots. There was death. There was horror. There was sin. And unfortunately, these things do exist. And they have existed in the church right there from the beginning. And they'll continue to exist until Christ comes back. And we just have to be aware of that this is the way it is. But it makes it very clear, Paul makes it very clear that we are to avoid them, have nothing to do with such people. You know, again, we live in an age where tolerance is a virtue. You know, if you don't tolerate others, you're seen as a bigot, as someone who's bad. But the fact is that we should not be hanging out with people who are like this. People who say that they're Christians and are living immoral lives, we should not be breaking bread with them. We should not be hanging out with them. That's, Paul mentioned this in 1 Corinthians, where he says, come on. Yeah, there are people who say they're Christians, they're living in adultery, doing all these horrible things. Don't have any fellowship with them. I may not have a choice about riding the bus with them. I have no choice because we both got on the same bus, or we both went to the same diner. But if I say, I'm going to go hang out with so-and-so, don't hang out with people that are bad. And I'm not talking about non-Christians. I'm talking about people who say that they're Christians. They have a form of godliness. Well, if there are people who claim to be Christians and you know that they're living immoral lives, they're doing things they're not supposed to be doing, sorry. We don't associate with them. We avoid them. And unfortunately, again, we live in a time where we're so stressing tolerance that we're being permissive about sin. We allow too many things to happen that we should not allow to happen. And as Christians, we have to draw the line and say, no. You cannot do that. And the thing is that the Bible is very clear, like Paul says again in Corinthians, bad company corrupts good morals. You start hanging out with people who are lax in their morality, in their talk. You're going to become like them. One of my favorite analogies for that is when I was a kid. I used to work these summer programs, CETA programs, where the government would pay for you to have jobs. So I would work a summer job. And I remember this one summer, I worked with a kid that always kept saying, serious. Well, you can imagine what I was doing by the end of the summer. I was going, serious. You hang out with somebody who's got bad habits, you're going to acquire those bad habits. And if their bad habit is cursing, you're going to acquire that cursing. If their bad habit is being profane toward things of God, you're gonna. If their bad habit is telling jokes that are inappropriate, you're gonna be passing on those jokes also, and those things are gonna be filling your mind. As Christians, we have to be so careful with that. I remember John Wesley had a rule. One of his rules was that he would give anyone 3 minutes. But if in 3 minutes that conversation was heading downward instead of upward, he would break the conversation and walk away. And I think that's a very good rule. When I've been in places where the conversation begins to descend, and and I have been in places like that. I remember in Bible college, one of my girlfriends, she knew this about me. You know, we'd be hanging out with other Christians, and as soon as that conversation started going down, I mean, we're talking young Christians who are preparing for ministry. They're sitting around, and their conversation begins to descend. I would not rebuke them. I did not want to get into a fight. I would just get up and say I'm leaving. When she saw me get up, she would leave too, because she knew if George is getting up, this conversation is going downward, and he doesn't want to be part of it. We need to have that kind of mindset to be bold and say, no, you know, I'm not gonna participate with that. On the contrary, I want to hang out with people that are godly. I want to hang out with people that are Christian, who are promoting things, that are people who are talking about spiritual things, not people who are talking about gossip and slander and horror and, you know, no, let's talk about things that are building up the church, building up Christians, things that are, you know, that are helpful to me as a believer and that will be helpful to them as believers. Any questions, comments? Well, we're going to stop there. I figured out we were going to make it that far, and then next week we'll pick up on verses 6 through 9.
6.
Yeah, verse 6. What was that? Yeah, verse 6 next time.
Right.
So no questions? Nothing?
No, not at this time.
Well, first of all, Facebook, have a good night. Rob, good seeing you. God bless you.